I'd like to thank everyone for coming tonight. It's days like this where the book industry wishes we had more rainy days, but I guess as a Seattleite, it's nice to have sun every once in a while. So we're really excited to have everyone here. Some of you may know this is the University Bookstore, of course. We're the largest independent bookstore on the West Coast, and we're the oldest in Washington State. And we always like to see faces here. We do about 500 events a year, so if you're ever in the city and think of doing something fun, we appreciate to entertain you. But tonight, we're thrilled to have Mark Leibovich, author of This Town, Two Parties and a Funeral, plus plenty of valet parking in America's Gilded Capital. Mark is a New York Times Magazine chief national correspondent based in Washington, D.C. In 2011, he received the National Magazine Award for his story on Politico's Mike Allen and the changing media structure of Washington. He also worked at the Washington Post, the San Jose Mercury News, and the Boston Phoenix, and is the author of The New Imperialist, a collection of profiles on technology pioneers. Leibovich lives in D.C. And tonight, Mark is in conversation with Seattle Times political reporter and vice president of the Pacific Northwest newspaper Guild, Jim Bruner. Sorry about
You've been reading my Twitter bio, I see.
I have. But a few last notes. If you parked in our lot, we do validate for parking, so you can just see me after the event, and I'll be able to do that. We do have books for purchase right behind us here, so feel free to stop in our children's department, and they can help you with that. But otherwise, I'd like to welcome Mark and Jim.
Thanks.
Well, I just wanted to, kind of start out with asking you, you've written a pretty damning profile of DC narcissism, corruption, whatever you want to call it, sort of an entertaining sociological study in some parts.
Sure.
You sort of admit up front that you're a member of the club that you're writing about. You've lived in, I guess, DC for 16 years at the time of publication.
Yeah, 17 now. Yeah.
And in one of my favorite lines, you said, "Sucking up is as basic to Washington as humidity." So I guess I'm wondering, have we reached peak sucking up in DC, or could there be still a more saturation point?
Oh boy. Well, I mean, essentially, the broader message there is, first of all, you're asking. I'm now in Seattle, Washington, so I was run out of town, so I'm like no longer sucked up to it all. No, I mean, essentially, the language of obsequiousness, the language of sycophanticness, the language of spin, the language of just trying to, lobby, get someone to come around to your position. That's the economy of Washington. It's trying to build relationships. It's sort of like we have this, in Detroit they make cars, in Milwaukee they make beer, here they make, all kind, airplanes, whatever, software, Silicon Valley. In Washington, theoretically, we make policy, laws, but we just haven't a lot lately. So and yet you have this booming economy, this boom town that is built, that has made a lot of people very wealthy. It's now the richest metropolitan area in the United States. But we don't make anything. We make a lot of, frankly, just sort of influence and BS, and that's sort of what the sucking up sort of looks like. And what I try to do in this town is give people sort of a fuller cinematographic sense of what the city looks like and what the dysfunction looks like, which in fact looks like a big party. Mm-hmm. But that's sort of the world I try to describe.
And you're part of the party in some instances, aren't you? Describe your role. Before your book came out, there was a lot of chatter in DC that I was reading. Politico, one of the publications that you write about, is being part of the kind of insider game.
Right.
Was sort of trying to guess what was in the book and psychoanalyze your purposes.
Bizarre. It was great.
I remember reading that piece at the time and thinking, what are they trying to say? And also trying to say, well, Mark, or I think they said they call you Lebo.
They do. At least they said
like
they
that?
do. No, I really don't.
Okay.
But they look like
you want to be in the game too, as well as write about it.
That was a fascinating spectacle. That story. Basically, there was this book that people knew about. People were scared of it because I was going to name names, and I was going to, break an unwritten rule, which is that people on the inside are not supposed to speak critically of others on the inside. It was a traitor to my class, basically. And I'm an insider. I work for a major news organization. I cover politics. You know, I know these people. I get invited to these parties. At least I used to. We can get into that.
Yeah.
But essentially, so Politico, everyone knew this book was coming out, and it was going to come out in July. Politico, specifically Mike Allen and Jim Vandehei, who were two of my former colleagues at the Post, who, you know, like everyone, we all sort of know each other. They wrote this piece on the eve of the last year's White House Correspondents' Dinner, you know, where they basically they debriefed a bunch of people I was fact-checking with to try to get a sense of who my targets were, who I was going after, what kind of questions I was asking. And it was interesting because these were like off-the-record meetings, and that's fine. People can obviously tell people what they want, but I just never seen a story like that before. And they were saying, you know, it seems like Leibovich is asking these people, you know, for absolution. He's trying to work out his own guilt about his. It was a really weird story, and the backlash to that was such that, you know, a lot of people blogged about it, and they thought it was a ridiculous story, and that actually generated a lot of, I guess, I hate the word buzz, but it helped drive a lot of interest in the book and, frankly, sales in the book in the weeks leading up to the ultimate publication.
Right, they seem to frame it as you were giving people a heads up, which I think they said is some kind of cherished tradition of the insiders in Washington.
Yeah, well, actually,
do you think they misportrayed what you were doing? You were fact checking.
I mean, maybe. I mean, first of all, they didn't. What would have bothered me is if they actually found something. I mean, they didn't. They found nothing about what was in the book. It was I don't know how hard they were trying, but they were sort of doing I just had never seen anything like that before.
Yeah,
I mean, you could do that with any much awaited book that's being written. I mean, I've never known anyone to sort of go up to the people Bob Woodward was fact-checking with, or, I mean, you know, because Insider or, you know, so you could actually do that. It was just kind of a bizarre thing, but whatever. Yeah. It ultimately, I think, led to a backlash and helped the book.
So you mentioned since the book's been published, you said, you know, the party invitations have declined. Is that really true, or is this a case where what Washington likes the most is to talk about itself? So you're, you know, what's happened to you?
Absolutely nothing. I mean, I was, you know, I've been probably invited to more things. I mean, I don't particularly like these things. I mean, as you could probably maybe tell. I mean, there was, I guess, the White House Correspondents' Dinner last week, which was when we rolled out the paperback. Tammy Haddad, who was a kind of a social fixer, socialite type, who's kind of made Washington work for her, kind of a larger-than-life, you know, towering figure, did not like the way she was portrayed in the book. And she has this sort of iconic brunch on the day of the White House Correspondents' Dinner at the home, the now empty home of the late Katharine Graham, and sort of symbolic that they sort of go into her empty home and have this silly little party. Actually, it's a big party. Anyway, and she also works for a lot of media companies, and she controlled the guest list of the coveted Vanity Fair Bloomberg party at some embassy. And apparently, according to BuzzFeed, and they wrote this because all we care about is each other, I was blacklisted, and Tammy forbid me from being on the guest list. And I was, of course, you know, this was, of course, a story. I mean, God forbid anything be happening in Ukraine or, you know, something. And so they called, and I think the quote I gave was, the words badge of honor come to mind. But yeah, I mean, again, this is emblematic of the kind of real silliness with which this book was received in D.C., which was a great contrast to how it's been received the rest of the country, which, you know, I think has been a mix of, obviously, you know, people have been entertained, so that's nice, but just real engagement and real concern and real, frankly, you know, real disappointment.
And you mentioned the White House Correspondents' Dinner. Of course, that's your annual spectacle that I think, I mean, talk about that. You don't go, right? The New York Times has boycotted these for some time, which kudos to you, I think.
Kudos to us.
But, you know, you should write a story about congratulating yourself. Or
we do.
BuzzFeed could do it.
BuzzFeed could do it, exactly.
Talk about that and this, what it symbolizes to you, or what it means, and what it's like. You know, have you attended in the past? Do you know what they're like?
Yeah, no, the White House Correspondents' Dinner used to be this very sleepy annual spring banquet in which a bunch of, you know, Washington correspondents, they brought a guest, you know, often, you know, maybe a member of Congress or a senator or a White House staff person, someone, you know, who's a source or who they can have a dinner with and watch the president speak and make a bunch of jokes. And you know, really in the last few decades, it's kind of metastasized into this like 5-day Mardi Gras of pre-parties and after-parties and brunches and, you know, sponsorships and movie stars coming in. You know, these collisions of these bubble worlds, which you have like, you know, you have Paris Hilton and the Kardashians sitting next to, you know, John Boehner and Joe Biden or whoever. I mean, it's just this weird mix of people who exist in these bubble worlds just all coming together. And frankly, I mean, you have to ask yourself, what are we celebrating here? I mean, this is like, is the White House press, is the Washington media such that we just need to praise each other lavishly over several days every year? I mean, tens of millions of dollars are spent on these things. You know, news organizations are paying, you know, huge money at a time when supposedly they're like closing bureaus and, you know, stopping, you know, laying people off. And I mean, it's all very odd. And, you know, frankly, I think it's an abomination. And I also think it's perfectly emblematic of the disconnect that you know, I think is at the center of this book. But
is it just a celebration, or is it also the chumminess with the people that you're covering?
I think it's both. I mean, look, I think, first of all, I think it sends a terrible message. Now, I don't want to be holier than thou here. I mean, I think, you know, Dean Baquet, who was the former Washington bureau chief of the Times and who's now the managing editor of the Times, when he was bureau chief, I guess in 2007, he discontinued our Getting a Table. And, you know, I've been to several before, and there, you know, you can get some work done. I mean, I'll be honest, I mean, there's a lot of newsmakers that are in one place, and you can saddle up to whoever, you know, somewhere, and you might want to pick up some stuff. I usually drink too much there. It's like there's just like this weird blur of sameness. It's just same outfits, same people, same speeches. I mean, I guess modern presidents have actually learned to hire pretty good ghostwriters. I mean, I think President Obama's routines can be pretty funny. I mean, most of them can be, but I mean, you can watch it on TV, but it's just bizarre.
Yeah, the jokes are funny. I mean, I think you quote in the book Obama, again, sort of symbolizing the Politico coverage. He made the joke about how Politico might respond to Japan's surrenders.
Yeah, where's the bounce?
Where's
right?
the bounce?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Everything is analyzed, even things maybe not worth analyzing. I was wondering, though, you know, in the big picture, the media landscape in D.C., I mean, do you think that all of this insider reporting is a complete abomination, or is there sort of room for that for the Washington audience, which wants to read it? There's obviously a market for it. Yeah. And yet there can still be serious reporting done that benefits the rest of the country. Or do you think it drowns out that serious reporting?
I think that's a really good point. I mean, first of all, there is a market for it. There's a huge market for it. I mean, Politico was very, very smart in recognizing it, and they basically said, we are going to cover politics on our website, on our, you know, whatever platforms we have. You know, the way ESPN covers sports. I mean, these are like exhaustive. I mean, we're catering to political junkies, whereas ESPN caters to sports junkies. And look, I mean, there are millions of people who care that much about politics. I happen to be one of them. I happen to read Politico, you know, quite often. So, I mean, I'm guilty, and I know that market exists. I do think that when you know, reduce everything to the lowest common denominator of who's up, who's down, personalities, and you do sort of lose the real life effect on, you know, the people who are supposedly being served, you're doing a major disservice, but you're also adding to the disconnect that I'm talking about. And I think that, you know, again, Washington in many ways, especially by this Politico ethic, is driven like a big football game, or covered like a big football game, and I think that that's dangerous.
Another line I appreciated or liked from your book, there was a long anecdote, I guess, in the book about this thing that erupted in the news where emails were leaked to you by, or essentially copied to you by an aide to Darrell Issa, and it got out that he had done that, and a bunch of people were angry. He got fired, and you said the best reaction you saw to that on Twitter was that in sort of the project of reporting your book, you actually got people to act out in real time how obsessed Washington was with itself.
Right.
Do you want to
John
talk about
Dickerson's
that?
quote. Yeah.
I thought that was a really telling anecdote.
It was. Yeah. No. Essentially, I mean, this is probably the longest. It is the longest chapter in the book. It's chapter 8. It's the saga of Kurt Bardella, who was this orphan, didn't go to college, just sort of went to Washington, just dying to become a political player. Like, he didn't care about policy. He didn't care about anything political growing up. He just watched The West Wing and he memorized episodes. And, you know, he had this very modern cinematographic sense of what politics is supposed to be like, the sort of quick twitch, you know, high drama. rendering of what is actually a very glorifying view of Washington, especially compared to House of Cards, and we can talk about that. But so Kurt came here. He found a patron. He said, "I'm not so much a Democrat or Republican. I'm not a D or an R. I'm an O, opportunist." And the Republicans discovered him first. Darrell Issa, who is a very ambitious congressman, wealthiest man in Congress, became chairman of the House Oversight Committee, a very conservative Republican. And Kurt is extremely ambitious. For a press person to see your name to like seeing your name in the paper as much as he did is a very dangerous thing. So he, I guess I kind of seized on this the way journalists sometimes do, and I wanted him to be a subject of my book, and he started forwarding me these emails that congressmen were sending him, reporters were sending him, staff people were sending him that didn't know they were having their emails forwarded, and they were rightfully not happy. He was fired, and what was striking about this was, obviously that was not good for him to be fired, but this became a huge story, like in the tiny little world we're talking about on Capitol Hill. I mean, this was the subject of over 100 blog posts and stories in Politico. I think Politico itself had like 36 stories or something like that. The Washington Post wrote about it. The New York Times wrote about it. It was amazing. And this was the same week that Egypt was blowing up. The government was about to shut down. It actually didn't, but it was one of the first brinksmanship moments. And it was just a bizarre thing to be in the middle of. And it also sort of told everyone that, hey, he's working on a book. Let's be even more nervous. It was an odd thing, but ultimately, Kurt got his job back in 3 months. He became more famous. People sort of forgot what he was in the news for. They forgot what he ever lost his job for. He left Darrell Issa's office a few months ago, is now in business for himself. He's making a ton of money. He turned up in New Hampshire a couple of months ago because Darrell Issa was giving a speech there, and Kurt started sending all these blind, off-the-record emails to reporters he'd never met saying, hey, you might want to think about Darrell Issa as a presidential candidate. So I actually wrote in the afterword of the paperback, in which I talk about the whole last few months. I say, Darrell Issa Kurt wants people to think that Darrell Issa is running for president. I should have seen this coming. This was the logical end game. But every time Kurt's in the news, and he does wind up in the news a lot, I sometimes will tweet things like, one day I turned around and my little monster was all grown up.
This mentioning game of who might be a presidential candidate is kind of a blast and a ritual in its own right. I mean, we see it out here in a lesser sense in Seattle, people being mentioned as they may be a cabinet person. I mean, and it's kind of gross even trying to report out these stories because literally sometimes it's just some junior aide who wants their boss to be mentioned, and there's no shot that they're going to be up for this position.
Yeah, no, we're in the age of speculation, and that's not. There doesn't have to be any real effort behind it, and it's good to be mentioned. I mean, I guess if you're a U.S. senator and there's something in the bloodstream that you're being spoken of as a possible running mate or whatever, I guess it's going to help your profile.
Yeah, so sort of noticeably absent from the this town discussion are two U.S. senators here, Patty Murray, Maria Cantwell. I mean, how do they fit into the ecosystem there? And of course, you did tell me before we were talking about a good anecdote you had about Maria Cantwell, so you could remind us of where she came from. But.
Yeah, no, Patty Murray and Maria Cantwell are completely beyond reproach. Every candidate, every politician from Washington State. No, So Maria Cantwell. I mean, I don't know either of them terribly well, but I remember I used to be a tech reporter back before I was a political reporter, and I did a story on people leaving Capitol Hill to go into tech companies, and Maria Cantwell was a former congresswoman, went to work at Real Networks, and I remember interviewing her, and she was saying, I love this. This is great. I love the private sector. I have seen the light. I can't imagine, having any other kind of life. And I said, so you would never think about going back into government or politics? Would you just go, no way. I can guarantee you will not do that right now. And every time I see her, I say, Senator. And I think her line was, I think her line was, mark my words. I think that's what she said. And I said, and whenever she sees me, she goes, mark my words. So it's like a little joke we have.
Yeah, it's like read my lips.
Something like that. It's the senatorial.
So she, of course, went on to beat Slade Gorton, the last Republican senator, from the state. So you talk a lot in the book about or some of the book about the revolving door kind of game that goes on, the influence peddling. And that is something that we see here. Patty Murray's office is a revolving door to some extent of people going into lobbying. Our former Congressman Norm Dix left. But some of the usual sort of I want to spend more time with my family or whatever.
Yeah, I want to spend
slow
more
down
time
the pace,
with my
and
money.
then he takes a job with the high-powered sort of lobbying law firm.
Right.
I think his cooling off period is done, so he can pick up clients.
Mm-hmm.
Is that just inevitable? Is that changing at all? And I mean, should it change at all to kind of change the outsider's view, of
Right.
DC?
Well, I mean, here's the deal. I mean, 50% of all U.S. senators go on to become lobbyists now. That compares to 3% of U.S. senators in 1974. Okay, roughly the same proportion of congressmen. And sort of the broader message is no one leaves Washington anymore. The whole notion of going to Washington, performing your government service, and then returning home to your farm or your medical practice or whatever is doesn't exist anymore. I mean, it's just no one leaves. You enter, in the words of Tom Coburn. I mean, some people leave, but most people just sort of stay. And I asked Trent Lott, who's a former senator, who's now a lobbyist, who was sitting in his lobbying office, and he sort of quit out of nowhere. He was a very powerful Republican. He was the whip. And he just suddenly went in to join John Breaux, his former Democratic colleague from Mississippi. Breaux's from Louisiana, Lott's from Mississippi. And they started a lobbying firm together, and I said, and he was going on about how much he hates Washington, and I hate it here, I just want to go down to my home in Mississippi. I said, so if you hate it so much, why are you still here? And he looked at me like I was crazy. He said, well, one, this is where all the money is. And also this is where all the problem is, but mostly it's where all the money is. Mm-hmm. And I just sort of have a grudging appreciation for him actually not trying to cloak it in some higher purpose or anything. John Breaux actually has a famous line in which someone accused him of like being bought and paid for by some oil interest, and he said, "I can't be bought, but I can be rented." This was when he was that was when he was in Congress.
Very honest.
Yeah, and then someone called him a cheap whore, and he said, "Let me correct you. I'm not that cheap." So again, I sort of admire the willingness to admit to that.
And we had a congressman here from Spokane, George Nethercutt, who ran on
term
limits and decided he liked it there. Mm-hmm. And then later went on, of course, to be a lobbyist after he left.
Right.
So, do reporters fall into the same problem to some extent? They get there and they're, I'm going to come in and I'm going to be the next Bob Woodward or whatever. Of course, you know. And then they get there and I think you quote a Daily Show skit.
Yeah, I love that skit by Wyatt.
They get enamored. Talk about that.
First of all, it's a great skit. You should look at Wyatt Cenac did it. But essentially, I mean, it's a tremendous temptation for a journalist in Washington because the lights are very bright. There are parties all the time. The free food is lavish. And look, you're in the shadow of the White House and the Capitol and the monuments, and it's kind of heady, and there's a lot of attention being paid to this. And it's very easy to be to become like cheaply famous there, and also cheaply rich there. It's just like there's so much money there. There is a value proposition as being seen as someone who knows how Washington works. So we'll bring you into our lobbying firm, and you can be really rich too. I remember I was doing a talk in Manchester, New Hampshire, a few months ago at a college, and a young reporter for the Concord Monitor came up to me, and she's 25 years old, and she said, "Look, I've been doing this 2 years. I read all this Washington stuff, Huffington Post, Politico, BuzzFeed. All these people younger than me or my age have these huge Twitter followings and these big, these blogs, and everyone knows, and they go on TV, they go on cable and everything. And I just feel like I'm getting behind. How do I get some of this?" And I'm like, you're living in a real community. Concord, New Hampshire, you're actually writing stories that affect the readers that you might see every day. What you're talking about is not, it's not real life, but it's also not journalism. It's all sort of like this big, intoxicating kind of ball of fluff, which a lot of journalists can get trapped in, and I think I think maybe on an unconscious level, one of the reasons I wrote this book is to sort of check myself before I became too much part of that. That's probably giving my psychology a little bit too much credit than I deserve, but it's a pretty fascinating dynamic because that didn't exist years ago.
And then, is that you called, I think, the news cycle now, as we all know, is never stops, and it sort of just, I think you described it as just, it goes and it goes and winds up where you started. Nothing really happened, but a lot of people wrote a lot of stories, and there were a lot of tweets in the interim.
Yeah, no, it's there's there's a line in here. I mean, you see these stories that begin in Politico, and then the reporter for Politico goes on to Morning Joe and talks about the story that he wrote, in which much speculation is going on, and then another reporter for BuzzFeed or Huffington Post will write about the discussion on Morning Joe and how something is now in the bloodstream, and then the increased buzz is written about as an actual story back in Politico, which then gets more discussion on Wolf Blitzer's show, and so all of a sudden you have something that is a beltway discussion, and it's a completely self-generated news item that has no factual basis, but it's noise.
And even more seriously, just the last thing on that point, I read Jack Abramoff's memoir, and
You did too, huh?
Yeah.
I thought I was the only one. I thought
a
I was like doing
a couple of us.
I was doing this public service where I could read all
it
these memoirs that no one else had to.
was self-serving, but
it was good. I learned a lot.
I enjoyed it. The thing that I thought was so interesting was he said one of his most powerful tools to sort of corrupt lawmakers or their staffs was to casually mention,
"You should come work.
For us."
Yeah, exactly.
That I assume just happens still all the time.
Yeah.
Absent Jack's not around, and
he's around.
I feel like it happen. It must happen to reporters too.
It must. I'm sure it does. I mean, I've never had that conversation, but Jack Abramoff said that when I had a conversation like that with a member of Congress or a senator or a staff person, I knew that I owned him. Meaning that there was this preemptive bribe, this understanding that if this relationship continued to work, there would be a 7-figure payoff when you are done, serving the public in your current job. So, that book was, he's one of my favorite convicted felon authors. So,
right.
Yeah.
Well, Randy Cunningham, did he?
I haven't read his book yet.
Is he
out yet?
Is he out or is he dead? I can't remember.
I don't know. He could still have a book left in him.
Okay.
Well, I'll be browsing the shelves afterwards to see.
You wrote about serial sucking up with regard to Obama, the hope change element, and yet you're writing this book at a time where everything is the way you're describing it in D.C. Has the culture, his administration moved the needle at all on changing the culture? Or can he not even do it because he's just there passing through, and these people are the permanent residents?
Yeah, I mean, look, he certainly ran in 2008 on promising to change the culture or try really hard to change the culture of Washington. He said explicitly that it was a huge failure of his. I don't know how hard he really tried. I mean, the fact is, look, the presidency is not something I can even begin to fathom or understand. I mean, this is like, presidents exist in kind of their own space. I mean, the amount of stress and sort of superhuman stamina and stuff that they know. I mean, so it's not something I could ever identify with. But no, I mean, Washington seems very similar to. I mean, they've done a lot of never minds. I mean, they said no lobbyists in the White House. They've made several exceptions. They said, campaign finance system. We're not going to work with super PACs. They work with super PACs. I mean, there have been a number of reversals, and look, that's I guess pragmatic politics. But I mean, but he would say he's gotten a lot of things done. So,
I mean, look ahead to 2016. Do you think there's any prospect to change? I mean, we could have a race between Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush, for all we know. Doesn't bode well for really changing what D.C. is about, does it? What would it take to change?
What it would take? I have to say, I mean, I don't know if we'll get this candidate on either side in 2016, but I mean, America is ripe for another change candidate, whether it's someone who focuses on campaign finance reform, which just is like, I think there's a pretty wide agreement has just become this complete outrage. Just like the notion of just like going to kiss the ring of these billionaire. I mean, it's just a bizarre situation with that. As I go out now, I mean, there's a huge hunger for Elizabeth Warren to get in, if nothing else, not just to sort of just to make her a cleaner debate. I mean,
right.
She will be something different. I mean, I'm sure there will be people on the Republican side who are offering themselves as something different. I mean, I would be nice if a third-party candidate could actually get some traction. See how that goes.
Elizabeth Warren's coming out here for one of these readings, and
maybe she'll make.
She may have a few more people here.
No, actually, you know what? Look at, but it's such a beautiful day out today.
Yeah. Well, and it strikes me that just knowing Washington and Seattle politics, she would have tremendous appeal.
Right.
For a lot of people in this area. So
sure, yeah.
Now she keeps saying she's not running, right?
They always say that. Yeah. No, look.
What's the clue that you look for that they're now lying or?
I don't know. Their lips are moving. I don't know. I mean, no. Elizabeth Warren. Look, I'm sure she's sincere. I mean, she hasn't. She hasn't done a lot in the Senate. I mean, she's been pretty nose to the grindstone. I mean, I think there's a real mythology around her based on her record, her past. I mean, sort of her biography. My native Massachusetts always has to have a losing presidential candidate in the race in order to make it complete. So if she gets the nomination, but no, it's all very. I do think that the Democratic Party is quite hungry for some alternative. I don't think the bench is that deep beyond Hillary at this point.
What kind of change would you like to see in coverage of the next presidential race that would be beneficial? I think you wrote about in the book the spin room after these debates. Describe that. Describe the utility of that to the average voter.
Well, there is no utility, so that's easy. I mean, the spin room is this thing that was created a few decades ago, in which after a debate, you have these rooms set aside for basically the top aides, the surrogates of the candidate, to just spout talking points and bullshit to like huge mobs of reporters, and very little is transacted, and it's just this weird spectacle. And then often the cable stations will cover the spin room as a spectacle that's worth coverage. And it's like one of those. It's a classic bad political habit that no one feels the need to break. It's like the Correspondence Center. It's like, why are we here? Well, this is what we've always done. And
like agreeing to off-the-record briefings by administration officials. I mean, that's tricky, isn't it? How do you do
it? Is tricky. Well, I'm not a beat reporter, so I haven't. But no, look, I mean, it's annoying. I'm sure the White House has their reasons for it. I mean, this is a fight that's been going on for years. Ideally, you get people, by name, but. I mean, to be honest with you, like the daily press briefings out of the White House yield very little of value anyway.
I mean, when you look at the media landscape now, you've got, it seems like there's the traditional media, there's the new startups. I don't know if you call Politico a startup anymore, but BuzzFeed, those. And you've got kind of the data-driven startups now, or at least they think everything can be analyzed with data.
Silver. We have one of those. Yeah.
And you've got, New York Times has a little... what's it called? The Upshot?
The Upshot, yeah. It just started like 2 weeks ago.
And then you've got the sort of people that want to be, we are completely outside. Glenn Greenwald saying, who, by the way, said of Hillary Clinton, literally, she's a hawk, used swear words, said, she's going to get elected, and is quite contemptuous of the New York Times and of the conventional media.
Sure.
How do you evaluate that landscape? What do you think? Is there value to having all those new voices?
I think there definitely is. Yeah, I mean, I will say that, look, I mean, the big stories in Washington traditionally, I mean, yes, there is this class of insider journalists. The big stories are traditionally broken by outsiders. I mean, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein were outsiders when they broke the Watergate story. Bob Woodward certainly isn't an outsider anymore. But no, I mean, they were Metro reporters. No one knew who they were. They were just pounding the pavement, and it was sort of old school journalism. I mean, Glenn Greenwald certainly was an outsider. I mean, he broke, was largely responsible for a lot of this MSA reporting this year, and was sitting in Brazil where he lives.
Right.
Michael Hastings, wrote one of the biggest stories of the first term of Obama. When he got General McChrystal fired, he was a very proud outsider. So, I mean, look, one of the perils of just the intoxication of being on the inside is that you kind of miss the water. I mean, you're a fish, and the fish are the last to discover the water. And you always, I think, especially if you live in Washington and you cover this and you belong to a major news organization, you have to always, remind yourself, I'm a fish, and just watch the water. So, does that make any sense? It's been a long book tour, guys. It's been like I'm sleep deprived. It's just like, okay.
What's the weirdest?
It's a beautiful day.
Yeah. What is the life? How has the tour been? You said the book's been received differently outside of DC than in DC.
Yeah.
What's the? I guess first of all, what's the nastiest reaction you got from within? And I don't know, maybe describe the more interesting ones from out on the road.
Yeah, I mean, well, the tour's been great. I mean, look, being out of Washington is a great thing. I mean, the first go-around with this, when it was actually just starting to catch on, I mean, I did some traveling, but mostly it was media. I mean, it was out of New York and D.C., and I came out here and San Francisco briefly, but it was, there was like the sense of discovery. Now more people have read it, and it seems to be kind of quietly have developed like a place in the bloodstream, and people use the term, well, that's so this town. And that's pretty cool. I mean, it's cool that like there are now people who kind of know this language and maybe, there's a new kind of the shame kind of has like a form that you can sort of see. I mean, but it's been a blast. I love, again, it's been really, really fun. People still seem to care, and hopefully more people will read it.
Well, I know that we wanted to have time for some audience questions. I was going to ask one more thing. Did you hope that this would change anything, this book? Because it does, it feels like a spectacle that you've laid out. It doesn't really say, well, here's what we would do to fix anything. It's just sort of like, here's this reality show. Right. Sort of laugh at it and go vomit if you want, but.
No, yeah, I don't have like the 10 bullet point chapter and say, here are my 10, 10 suggestions for fixing Washington and fixing America and blah, blah, blah. I'm just not that, I'm not a prescriptions guy, but I do think that, I do think that this is not a definitive history. It's a portrait of a moment. It's a portrait of Washington at what I think is a tipping point. I hope that this disconnect is not sustainable. I think that, change comes mostly from without. I mean, it's like there's one of the things I wanted to outline in this book is that the incentive to change is very, very hard to come by when you're living in this sort of decadent aquarium, right? And that's sort of what has grown up there, and it's a product of a great deal of money and a great deal of sort of ease, and it's important to get beyond that. So, it's funny. Yesterday, I was in, where was I yesterday? Oh, in the Bay Area yesterday. Sorry. Someone asked me in the audience. He said, "So, what are you going to do next? Like, what's your next plan? I mean, you obviously have to follow this up with something because we need a manifesto from you, or we need something." And I said, I'll tell you my plan. I'm actually going to, when I leave here, I'm going to get back in my rental car and drive back to San Francisco because I was up in Silicon Valley. I have to file a story that's due tomorrow morning, and then I'm going to catch a flight. And I need to I have a story due tomorrow. Like that's very, it's sort of a problem, a day job thing, and the kids thing, and like the fact that, so I can't afford the lofty sort of messianic way of sort of approaching this. But look, I do think that it's important to introduce a language of shame into what we do on a daily basis in politics. So.
I don't know. We just want to open it up. I don't know if anyone's,
Right. Yeah.
When I read your book and listening to you now, I was a journalist. I quit doing it 40 years ago, and actually I noticed a difference. And actually I stopped doing I worked for the Associated Press. Actually wrote some for the New York Times too, the Stringer, but I saw a real difference in journalism after Watergate, and I didn't see that it was a good change. One would think because of, and I've been thinking about it lately because on the news of late they're making all these ridiculous comparisons, in my political view.
Right.
Ridiculous comparisons.
This is worse than Watergate.
So I've been thinking a lot about that, knowing I was going to come here tonight, thinking about it even more. I didn't think that it was a good change. In starting around the mid-70s.
Yeah, no, I mean a couple of things I think happened after Watergate, back to journalism. I mean, first of all, it created this incredibly hot and sexy period for journalism. I mean, apparently I was like 9 years old then, but people were just rushing to get into journalism, and everyone wanted to be the next Woodward and Bernstein, and people were just pounding the pavement. And I think it probably coarsened a lot of the journalism because people were just really, really distrustful and really, really eager to make their own mark. And I think it probably had some really good benefits in that there was more watchdogism, if that's a word, but also maybe more overreaching. It also, at least in Washington, Watergate created this whole class of famous journalists. I mean, it just became, All the President's Men, the movie especially, and it's one of the reasons I got into journalism, frankly. I mean, it sounds shallow, but it's just like it's an incredibly compelling look at it's sort of the how-to of journalism, and at the very, very basic, making phone calls and so forth. But it also, all of a sudden, you too could be played by Robert Redford theoretically, or Dustin Hoffman. I think that that sort of celebration or that sort of celebrity aspect of journalists in Washington has never really subsided. The last chapter in this, there's now like a epilogue and now an afterword. So the actual last numbered chapter in this, sort of lose track, is actually a kind of a birthday party for Ben Bradley, who was in his 90s. He's suffering from dementia, and it was right before the second Obama inauguration, which is the second bookend of the book. It was just sort of about like this world that was still kind of hanging on. You had all these sort of ghosts in the room, and Senator, who was it? I guess it was Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, who was like one of the 2 elected officials there, said, it's like walking into a novel. And you had, Vernon Jordan and, Bob Woodward and Barbara Walters, and you had just all these people who just weren't going anywhere. But it was a pretty poignant scene. It was almost elegiac. But anyway, but I think that all, again, it was part of a world that started with Watergate. Anyways, so. Yeah.
I was going to ask you about, I heard on Bob Garfield the other night on National Public Radio.
You listened, yes.
About your team there at the before the White House correspondence.
The colloquy on media ethics.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
It sounded like nobody came when you took all the
Exactly.
food home.
No. Well, that was, yes, that was part of
That was sort of the joke.
That was the joke.
But I heard him yelling, "Oh, what are you wearing? Armani."
Armani. Wasn't that a great
So
moment?
I thought if you could talk a little bit
Yes,
about
I would
that.
love to talk about our colloquy on media ethics. So Bob Garfield, who is a friend who hosts NPR's On the Media, really funny guy. He did a huge segment on the Media last weekend. It's online, on the Washington media and just what has happened to the Washington media and just Washington in general. And he basically, I was a recurring character in the book. I was his fixer. I was the one who took him to the Palm and told him, what to order. It was kind of a role. So Bob decided that he would convene a colloquy on media ethics in conjunction with a correspondence dinner, in which he would rent a suite at the Washington Hilton while the dinner was going on last weekend. And me and him and Jeff Goldberg of Bloomberg and this journalism professor at American University, we would convene a panel in which we would discuss media ethics. And Bob then took a poster and stood, at the entrance to the dinner while all these people in their tuxedos and gowns were walking by and said, "Please come to our colloquy on media ethics. On the 3rd floor, we have donuts, we have beer, we have soda." And so we all, prepared there at 7 o'clock at the appointed time, and no one showed up. And that was sort of the gag. We kind of expected that no one would show up. But because this was part of Bob's report, we all kind of, it was the end of his report, and he was something, I guess. Bob was doing this interview on some other NPR show. I was on with him, and they said, "Bob, what happened? Who showed up?" And Bob said, "Let's just say that crowd control was not a problem." So compared to the media ethics colloquy, this is a huge mob scene. So thank you all for coming.
Yeah.
So is this like a fire drill or something? Or
I don't know.
is the ice cream still? There's plenty of ice cream still available.
Apparently across the street, right?
Yeah. So, anyone else? Yeah.
What's your normal responsibilities or your normal beat, and how does that relate to the world that you outlined in your book, where your normal everyday duties, how does it relate to the party scene?
Yeah.
Why do they intersect and how do they intersect?
Well, they don't very much. I mean, basically, a lot of this stuff sort of outlives its usefulness. I mean, essentially, my job is the same, although I have different responsibilities. I mean, I work for the magazine now, so I have the luxury of more lead times. I'm going to write a column every other week for the magazine called Your Fellow Americans, which talks about a lot of this stuff, and actually that's what I had to finish last night. So, and I do features for the magazine, maybe half dozen a year or so. So I'm pretty busy, I mean, part of my job is being part of this world and just sort of having these, just knowing what's going on and hopefully adding value. I mean, I think one of the misconceptions people have about writers when they get known is that they are writers. It's like, oh, he just gets to write all the time. I mean, the essence of what journalists do is reporting, and people forget that. And you got to know stuff because otherwise you're just writing. So, or you got to learn stuff. So, I don't know. I mean, it all sort of interfaces. Again, I love getting out of town. So.
How long do you usually get for those profiles, by the way, that you're doing quite frequently in the
Not
magazine?
enough or too long if you're asking my bosses.
Right.
How's that? No, I mean, it can go anywhere from like 2 weeks to 3 months or something. I mean, it kind of depends. So, yeah.
A quick follow-up with the reincarnation of Kirk. He said he got reestablished and got into business. Just curious what kind of business he got into.
He's his own public relations consultant. He Yeah, he does. You know, he basically, it's interesting. He has approached a lot of kind of lower profile Republican congressmen and women and said, look, I mean, your press operation isn't getting you a lot of attention. Why don't you not employ a press secretary or communications director? Why don't you just use me? And, you know, I have all these contacts and I can get you more press and more attention than you might, you know, otherwise. And I guess, you know, it's a value you know, proposition that people are buying. But, I mean, it makes a certain amount of sense.
What kind of consulting fees and stuff like that?
I don't know. I mean, he says he's making a lot of money. So, I mean, why would he ever lie? No, I assume he's, I mean, I'm fairly certain that he's making a lot more than he was before.
Why was he accepted back into the fold? I would think he'd be radioactive after the...
It is pretty amazing, isn't it? I mean, the lesson there is that you will always eat lunch in this town again. I mean, there is really, that's the other thing, there's very little fall from grace. I mean, Kurt is, yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are people who don't trust him, and I wouldn't trust him with like a, I mean, it's sort of funny for me to say as the recipient of some of these emails, ultimately, but no, I mean, look, he's a hustler. But Washington's had hustlers for years, and he's the one I chose to profile. But, you know, I'm sure there are people who are going to think twice before doing business with him. So, but,
When
yeah.
I read your book about Kurt, I thought he just picked himself the perfect congressman to
He
work
did.
for, because the congressman is obviously greedy and cares very little about the truth. And from my perspective,
Right.
he was he wanted to be known at no cost. And of course, look at his background. Like, wasn't he a convicted felon, or he had?
Yeah.
And so you
Car
know,
thief.
he had elevated himself, using that word,
Yeah.
to a congressman, and he wanted all this. And I thought, Kurt is not your typical staff person. They
Right.
just found each other, and
They did.
It was perfect for the two
It's a
of them.
fascinating marriage. I mean, Darrell Issa refers to Kurt as like the son he didn't have, and Kurt refers to
But he
Issa as a father figure. I mean, it's all very Freudian in some ways. Yeah, no, I mean, look, I think many politicians love to get attention. They're desperate for
Well,
attention.
yes.
Obviously, that's a lot of the oxygen they breathe, they rely on. But no, there was a particular kind of mutual desperation between the two of them that I think ultimately served them both pretty well until it didn't. So, yeah.
Oh, just a quick question about House of Cards.
Uh-huh.
Is most of what was in there just over the top?
A little bit, but it's entertaining.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, look, an education bill wouldn't pass in one episode, but, and you know, without giving away too many of the plot lines, you know, some of the homicidal subplots might not be realistic, you know, when perpetrated by high-level elected officials. But yeah, I mean, it's real-ish. It's fiction. It's entertainment. It's entertainment. I think, you know, I suppose. I mean, there's this sort of whole school of thought in D.C. that we're so above this. How dare they spook? And I find it thoroughly entertaining. My feeling is, you know, what part of fiction don't you understand? So, yeah.
The insider type of organizations like political and so on, do they actually affect policy, or actually, okay, you got the gossip from that school.
Yeah.
I'm as guilty as loving that stuff as much as everyone else. But does it do things like Politico and the more insidery things, do they actually affect bills or policies that someone in Nebraska or Montana or here would actually affect?
Yeah, they could. I mean, look, I will say this about Politico. I mean, they've hired a ton of journalists, and not everyone is hiring a ton of journalists these days. And a lot of them are very good journalists, and they have broken some pretty important stories. I mean, they broke the whole Herman Cain as serial workplace sexual harasser story. I mean, no one knew about that, and he was the Republican frontrunner at the time. And they've broken a fair amount of stories. So, I mean, they can actually, you know, they have good reporters, and we've hired a couple of them. We've hired one of them. He sits right behind me. So, yeah, I mean, look, they're like any place. I mean, there's good with the bad, but they definitely have a following, and I think a lot of it's justified. So, thank you all very much for coming, by the way. This is great. I actually, I had very low expectations. They were like, oh, the weather. No one will come inside at all. There will not be a single person inside. So we definitely, probably like 15, 16 at its peak here. So, and I think there's still ice cream across the street if you still want it. Yeah. There's now a driving rainstorm predicted, so you can go tell all your friends. No, well, I'll stick around, sign books if you want. But thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jen.
Thanks, it was real fun.
Thanks, Brett. That was awesome.